I understand that a lot of new people have joined the congregation. So my name is Carl Dahlfred. You may have seen the name of my wife, son, and I in Grace Notes as missionary news has come out over the years. Number of years ago, 2005, I think, I moved to California and got married, and my wife and I became part of the congregation. And then in 2006, we went to the mission field in Thailand. So this morning, I just wanted to introduce myself briefly, talk about ministry and missions in Thailand, give some prayer points. But before that, I want to say thank you for your support, for your prayers, as we've sought to minister to the Thai people and to bring the gospel and teach the Word of God in a very distant part of the world. If you do not have the handout from the door on the music stand, you can grab one of those. I will be roughly speaking off these notes, but there's a bit more information there than I'm going to cover this morning. So we've been as missionaries in Thailand since 2006, after we left Southern California, and we've been in and out of Thailand during that time. For the past 3 years, I was actually in Edinburgh, Scotland, working on a PhD in world Christianity on a topic in Thai church history. And currently, we're living in Florida and working on getting back to Thailand. We thought we'd be back in Thailand already, but this past year, COVID messed up our plans, as I'm sure it messed up many of your plans. So we've been prevented from getting in the country because of COVID and some other reasons. But hopefully, the middle of next year, we'll be returning to Thailand. Previously, I was teaching church history and missions at Bangkok Bible Seminary. I was helping with editing and translation of Christian books into the Thai language. And we were working with a Reformed church in downtown Bangkok called Grace City Bangkok Church. But to orient you to Thailand, we have a map here. So on the first page, you'll see a map of Thailand. It's surrounded by Burma, Myanmar now, Laos, Cambodia, situated in Southeast Asia. Probably about 20 years ago, when the opportunity to go to Thailand first came across my table, I thought, well, that sounds like a great opportunity. Where is Thailand? So I had to look it up. It sometimes gets confused with Taiwan, which is an entirely different place. So just some quick stats on Thailand to give you a picture of what the situation is there in terms of religion, in terms of the gospel. You have about 65 million people, maybe a few more now, that were in 2021. But the overwhelming characteristic religiously is that it's Buddhist. It's 95% Buddhist. There's this idea that to be Thai is to be Buddhist. Buddhism is connected very closely to national identity. If you or any of your relatives are Irish or Italian, you may know that Irish Italian, Irish Catholic, very closely wedded together. Maybe you haven't been to church in 30 years, but hey, I'm Catholic. It's that kind of idea in Thailand. They may only go to the temple or do Buddhist ceremonies on important holidays or weddings or funerals, but if you criticize Buddhism, they're going to defend it, even if they don't know a whole lot about it. A minority of the country, 4%, is Muslim. That's mostly in the south near Malaysia. And then at around 1%-ish, you have Christians of all varieties. So you have Protestant, you have Catholic. I think there's one Orthodox church in the country. But for our purposes, what I'm going to focus in on is Protestant. And I use Protestant instead of evangelical or Reformed because Reformed is very, very small, and evangelical doesn't. All the Protestants tend to be evangelical of some variety. Liberal theology has gotten a very, very small foothold there, if any. So when we look at Protestants, we're talking about evangelical of some kind along a spectrum. Mostly broadly evangelical. There's quite a bit of charismatic influence as well, though. And that comes out numbers-wise to about 450,000 believers and 5,100 churches. Statistics are helpful, but sometimes when it's just pure numbers, it's hard to get sort of a feel of well, what does it feel like when there's 450,000 Christians in a country of 65 million? What that means is, if you're a believer, then you may be the only one at your workplace, the only one in your neighborhood, maybe the only one in your family or extended family. For students, they may be the only Christian in their school. So for Thai Christians, it can be very lonely when you're the only one. The average church size in Thailand is probably about 20 to 30 people. In some place like Bangkok or Chiang Mai, which is a large city in the north, you would get some larger numbers. But on the whole, most Thai churches are just very small. And the believers are really happy when they come together and meet other believers because there are so few around. It's a difficult place to be a Christian. There's many places without any churches at all. On your handout, the map on the right-hand side on the first page, that is a heat map of churches in Thailand from 2016. The blue areas are areas without any churches at all, 0 churches. The areas with yellow, that's one church, are in the yellow areas, and then the red areas is one or more churches. So as you can see, there is a large section of the country in blue where there are just no churches at all. I don't mean just not a Reformed church or not a Protestant church, but I mean no church, any sort of Christian presence of any variety at all. So if someone was dissatisfied with Buddhism, they were encountering problems in life, they were open to something new, there's literally no churches that they could go to in their area. There may be isolated Christians here and there who are disconnected from churches, but if they wanted to find out about Christ from a living, breathing person, it's like, well, where would I go? So with this situation, I mean, this is 2016. It was much worse in the past. A lot of this growth has only come in the past 25 years or so. It's just a difficult situation for Christians, and that's the thing that I want to emphasize. On the following page, I want to talk a little bit about why it's such a challenge for believers, being alone and then being faced with Buddhism every day. And the Buddhism there, and I don't want to talk about Buddhism too much, but talking a little bit helps you get a picture of what the situation is like for Christians and like for missionaries when they go there. It's a mix of pure Buddhism and animism, so we call it a folk Buddhism. So in the United States, when people get disillusioned with Christianity or whatever they think Christianity is, and they get involved in Buddhism, they meditate, they adopt a vegetarian diet, they do yoga or whatnot. Americans who are disillusioned with, the faith they grew up in tend to go towards the philosophical end of Buddhism. In Thailand, most people don't know about the philosophy of Buddhism. They couldn't name the Four Noble Truths. They just kind of know, well, we go to the temple and we give stuff to the monks and we say these chants and there's karma. And that's kind of it. I mean, some people would know more. There is a small sliver of Buddhists who are very serious about their Buddhism. But on the whole, it's just nominal Buddhism. It's important to them culturally, but in terms of personal day-to-day living, not so much. They're not trying to detach themselves of the world and remind themselves that the world is an illusion and cut themselves off from all desire to achieve nirvana. For most people, nirvana is this thing out there. It's like, that's not really doable. We can't ever achieve that. And nirvana, by the way, it's not the Buddhist version of heaven. If you watch American advertising, you sometimes get that impression. I remember seeing a commercial years ago. It was for, I think, a chocolate bar or nutrition bar of some kind, and this woman bites into the bar, and she's like, oh, it's like pure nirvana. It's like, nirvana is non-existence. So eating this chocolate bar is like not existing. It just doesn't make any sense if you know anything about Buddhism. But that's the impression we get in American pop culture. But for Thai people, nirvana, it's blinking out of existence and all suffering is ceasing, because conceptually, the greatest, Buddhism is all about escaping suffering. I mean, the gospel, on the other hand, we know that God uses suffering, God even plans suffering for us and puts us in situations where he knows that it will be difficult because he has a purpose and a plan. He redeems our suffering. But in Buddhism, there's no concept of this. Suffering is bad, therefore the only thing we should do is escape from it. And nirvana ultimately is escape from suffering, where you cease to exist, therefore your suffering stops. But for most people, it's like, that's really, out there. For their everyday needs, they go to the spirit shrine down in the corner, or someone had discerned that there is some sort of, spirit that lives in this tree over here, so they go, wrap some yellow ribbon around it, put some candles there, put a little picture there, and they light some incense, some joss sticks, and try to get whatever spirit there is, whether it's in a tree or a little amulet, to ward off evil and to get blessing for themselves. So on a daily basis, it's just a very practical kind of religion. People would go ahead and go to work or go to school and have their families and live their life, do whatever they want, but then they would have these other animistic kind of things added on. They might have the sacred tattoo to either to make them bulletproof, or wear the amulet when they go driving in order to protect them on the road. You'll see stories in the Thai media, this big car wreck, and the guy's interviewed afterwards. He's like, "Oh yeah, I got away unscathed, but I had my sacred amulet here." People don't put two to two together and think like, well, hey, we don't hear the stories about the guy who got in the car wreck and died with his amulet on. Those aren't reported. There's sort of selective information there, because people want to believe that these sacred supernatural things work. Thai people are interesting in that you can talk to them about spiritual things. In the United States, there's certain things you're not supposed to talk about in polite company, among them religion, politics, other things. But in Thailand, you can talk about religion. People will have spiritual conversations with you, but just don't expect them to convert. There's a spiritual bondage that comes from just personal sin. There's the attachment to Buddhism because of cultural reasons. There is demonic oppression, demonic deception. I haven't seen demonic activity, direct demonic activity myself, but I know people who have, and it is strange and it is bizarre. In a country, Thailand, where people will actually go to spirits and ask for things and then believe the supernatural things happen, one of the methods that Satan uses to deceive people is direct activity, where people would have contortions or speak in voices, or something happens to them and it's like it's the spirit doing them. Not everything that people claim is demonic activity is demonic activity. I think some of it is just because of lies they've been told and just deception. But that it does happen. Other barriers to conversion that I've seen there is just the desire to save face and make everyone look good. I'm from New England originally, and one of the things I like about New England compared to, say, the Deep South is our atheists are honest up there. If they think Christianity is a bunch of baloney, they'll tell you it's a bunch of baloney, and they don't believe it. In some place like the American South, which is very nominally Christian, it's much harder to sort of get at whether people are where they really stand in terms of the gospel. In Thailand, people would tell you, "Oh well, we're Buddhists, we're not Christians." It's like, okay, but I've told people about Christ before, and made the case like there's a creator, and he loves us and he can help, and we have sin, and it's just following the precepts of Buddhism and being a good person. It still doesn't wipe away our sin. And they've just said like, "Oh well, yeah, all religions teach us to be a good person," and they smile, and it's like there's not an engagement there, because they don't want to have conflict. They don't want there to be open disagreement, which I find difficult, because I don't know what they're objecting to. I don't know what they're disagreeing with. I want them to say, "Oh well, I don't think the resurrection happened because of such and such," or "No, that doesn't make sense because of this and that." But I don't have the opportunity, because they're just smiling and saying like, "Oh yeah, all religions teach you to be good. Yeah, that's really good. I'm glad you believe that." It's like, well, engage with me here a little bit, but it's difficult. There's evangelists who will invite people to walk the aisle or raise a hand or whatnot. I'm not into asking for raised hands or aisle walking, but some people do. And Thai people will raise the hand and walk the aisle, and they'll pray to believe, and then people will follow up on them, and oh, they're gone. That happens here, but in Thailand, you would have people think, "Oh, I don't want this evangelist to feel bad. Nobody goes forward, so I'll go forward." Or if it's a personal conversation, it's like, "Okay, I'll pray to believe in Christ, but hey, maybe it'll give a blessing." But they're not really interested, and they don't want the person who's asking them to feel bad. So there's a challenge of false conversion as well. With that said, the church in Thailand is growing. I showed you the map on the first page there. People are becoming Christians. Actually, the church in Thailand is growing at a slightly faster rate than the population growth. So I mean, if you know, statistics, particularly projecting the future, is kind of a dicey affair. But if the rate continued, you'd have 5%, 10% Christians in a number of years from now, in a few decades. Now, will that continue? We don't know. But good things are happening. But because it's such a big country and there's just so few Christians, you don't always see it. So whether it's missionaries or Thai Christians, you don't always see people coming to faith. One person here or two people there. Sometimes you don't see anyone come to faith in a year. But the church is growing. Thai Christians, they will share the gospel with those around them. They'll invite them to church. They'll invite them into the church community. And one of the things that a number of people ask me this as I share about Thailand and speak at churches is, why do Thai people become Christians? Part of it is because coming from a background where it's just you and your karma alone in the universe, there's no one who can help you, it's a fantastic thought that there is a God who exists, he made me, and that he loves me, and that he can help me. I mean, it's a radical new thought. And when people come into a time of their life when they have needs and they tried the amulets, they tried the shrine, it's not working, they're open to something new. And if they have a Christian friend who says, you should pray to Jesus, and they pray, something happens, and they're more open to hearing the gospel. Some people say, well, people come to faith through miracles. Well, a miracle like we see in the Gospels, sometimes that's the entree to learning more from Jesus. But no one's converted by a miracle alone. It's always the word going along with that. Thai people, they're sharing the gospel, they're bringing people to church. People experience the love of the Christian community. One of the strengths of the church, and you see this on the map on the first page, that red part all up near the north, that's mostly tribal areas. So you have the ethnic Thai majority, and then you have the tribal minority. So you have various different tribal groups in the north. You have the Karen and Lahu and the Lisu and the Aka and several others groups. And they live in northern Thailand, southern China, in Laos and Burma, and there's some high mountains in that area. And they just easily sort of cross over back and forth between the various countries, just walking over the mountains. But they're traditionally more animistic, less Buddhist, more removed from the center of power that enforces, Buddhist identity, and they've come to Christ in much greater numbers than the ethnic Thai have. I mean, there's some villages that, they all profess to be Christian. There's areas where it's not less than 1% Christian, it's more than 10% Christian. When I taught at Bangkok Bible Seminary, at the undergrad level, probably about 75–80% of the students were from tribal backgrounds, and they had come down to the city for biblical training. A number of them would go back to their villages. Some of them would go to other parts of the country. It's a little bit, so tribal Christians are a great strength of Thailand, but it's challenging for them to minister to the ethnic Thai as well, because the majority Thai view the tribal folks as kind of country bumpkins. They don't quite speak right. A lot of them speak Thai as a second language. They're from the hills. They tend to be poorer, lower education. So it's harder for them to gain acceptance among the majority Thai. But if they can be getting out and into the cities and other parts of the country, I mean, they know Thai language. Their culture is more similar than, say, someone like me coming from the West. I mean, there's a lot of potential with the tribal folks. One of the other benefits of Thai churches, one of the other strengths, is that they're small. Some in the American context would say, we need, mega churches, big churches, but when you only have 100 people in the congregation, or you have 30 people in the congregation, you can know each other. It's easy to bring people into community. You know when someone is missing. One tradition in Thai churches is they have a fellowship meal after every service. I think that has temporarily fallen by the wayside with COVID and online things, but after church is done, you all have a meal together, and that's the time to visit with one another, to pray for one another, to catch up with one another, and when new people come, to integrate them into the community. But of course, all is not rosy in any church in the world. Sometimes you read reports about things happening in other parts of the world, like, oh, those Christians are so brave, and wonderful things are happening here. Unlike in the United States, we see all our problems, but we see what's going well in other parts of the world. There's good things happening in Thai churches. People are coming to faith, but there's also challenges. There's a lack of churches. There's a lack of pastors. Probably only about half the churches in Thailand have a pastor or a full-time Christian worker of any variety. So that means you have a lot of churches with lack of biblical teaching, poor biblical teaching. Some of that gap is being filled by online seminary and Bible college courses. If a church is 20 or 30 people and you're all, just selling vegetables at the local market, or you're a rice farmer, don't have a lot of money, you don't have the money to call a pastor and his family and to pay them. But when you have some online Bible education, you can, open your tablet, every Tuesday night and get a course in systematic theology, then that's starting to fill the gap for some of these small churches without a full-time pastor. There's problems with moralism and legalism. Unfortunately, there's a lot of places in Thailand, from my observation, that the gospel is preached for people to come to faith, but once they believe, then the sermons are a steady diet of, obey, do God's will in order to get blessings. And there's a lot of focus on blessings and follow these rules. And one of the constant challenges for those of us who love the gospel, have a clear understanding of the need to be grace-centered and gospel-centered, is to keep that constantly in the biblical diet, and to emphasize to our Thai colleagues, or in my case, you had the seminary students, that grace, forgiveness, the gospel needs to be continually at the center of our teaching and preaching. It's not something that can be forgotten. Another challenge is because of the educational background. Like in many parts of East Asia, the education system in Thailand focuses on rote memorization. Students are oriented towards, what does the teacher want? What does the teacher want me to say on the exam? I'll just memorize this and spit this back. I've had a lot of issues with, at the undergraduate level, trying to ask the students question, what do you think about this? What would you do in this situation? Looking at church history, for example, it's like, I don't know, teacher, what did they do? Tell us, teacher. So teacher, what would be on the exam? Well, the things I emphasize in class will be emphasized in the exam. Okay, what are those? No, you need to think for yourself. At the graduate level, you have students who are a little bit older, in their 20s and 30s, some 40s, sometimes older than that. They'll engage more. They've had some more life experience. But the undergraduates, it's a challenge. And another big challenge is prosperity gospel and sort of a hyper-Pentecostalism coming into churches. You could ask me about this later, but I've butted heads with the prosperity gospel preachers a number of times, because myself and some other Thai pastors and professors, we've written things and put them online, distributed them to churches, warning people about folks like, a Benny Hinn or Bill Johnson, or some of these more, miracles and healings, and, give me 100 and I'll, God will give you 1,000 kind of people who just come in and they prey upon poor people. I mean, if we're concerned about, if people are concerned about social justice, I don't like that term, but if you're concerned about people who are marginalized and the poor being taken advantage of, well, oppose prosperity gospel, because it's just sort of a Christian version of, Christianized version of the lottery in many ways. So that's kind of an overview of Thailand. Where our part is our part in ministry there. We've been there about 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, not in country all the time, but we were involved, my wife and I, raise your hand, wife. So this is my wife's son. Our kids we have 3 kids where they're in the Sunday schools, right? Yeah. So we've been there about 10, 15 years. We were church planting in central Thailand, working with a Thai pastor and his church to try to plant a church in a nearby village. And then before we left Thailand most recently, I was teaching a Bangkok Bible seminary, teaching church history survey, Thai and Asian church history, introduction to missions, a short course on research, mostly about how to write footnotes and not plagiarize, both of which were vitally important, one of which was not as intuitive. And we were involved with a Reformed church in downtown Bangkok, together with, so together with some MTW missionaries and then a Thai pastor who was ordained, who studied in the U.S. and is ordained in the PCA. So right now we are in Florida, and we're working on getting back to Thailand. The idea is that we go back to Thailand either to Bangkok or possibly to Chiang Mai, which is a large city in the north, and I would return to seminary teaching. We would get back involved with local church ministry and seek to bring the gospel to people. We've had some challenges in getting back to Thailand, as I mentioned at the very beginning, because of COVID. So when the last few years, I've been in Scotland. We've been in Scotland. I was working on a PhD in world Christianity, and I would go back to Thailand every year in order to renew my visa, because Thailand requires you to show your face in person at the immigration office in Bangkok. Well, 2020, I had my tickets booked for June. Well, those got canceled. I couldn't go. I couldn't go back. I couldn't renew my visa, so I lost that. We get to the end of 2020, and we were hoping to go straight back to Thailand, but no visas. Visa applications are not being accepted. Our financial support as missionaries had fallen off a bit, and it was becoming obvious we need to come back to the United States. And we thought, well, we want to come back to Southern California, so let's look for some affordable short-term housing in California. And you laugh because it's really hard to find. So we're looking at that, and then we're looking at the lockdown situation here, and we were locked down fairly hard in Scotland. Besides, church mostly being online, except for a few months at the end of 2020, it was all online, and you weren't supposed to visit people in their homes, and you can only meet with one other person, one other household outside. And I mean, Scotland's a lovely place. I can tell you about it sometime. Maybe some of you have been there or want to go there. But when we left in March of 2021, there's no place to go except the grocery store. So we came back to the United States. We came to Florida because you could find affordable housing there, and we could sing in church, and we could take the Lord's Supper, and we could meet with the Lord's people. And so that was a breath of fresh air for us. So at the moment we're living in Florida, working on getting our financial support back up. I've been making some new church connections in Florida and elsewhere. Recently I went up to Seattle. Some of you may know Martin Hedman, who's at a church up there. Martin used to be here in Southern California, and I spoke and preached at his church there. So been trying to make some new connections with the aim of getting back to Thailand probably mid-year 2022, pending the financial support coming up and pending the COVID situation in Thailand improving. In terms of cases and numbers, like in Thailand, they still have the death ticker in the news. So there's still a lot of concern over there. In terms of restrictions, there's still tight border restrictions. You can get in. For some people, there's a 10-day quarantine. Domestically in Thailand, this is something that concerns us, is if you get a positive test, you're almost required to go to a field hospital and stay there for observation for a couple weeks. So we have some missionary friends who feel a little bit on edge about this because they have children, and it's unclear if your child gets a positive test, you get a positive test, would you be sent to 2 different field hospitals? Could you go together? If your child tests positive but you don't, could you go with them, or would you be separated from your kids? We're happy not to be in Thailand right at this very moment, but we're hoping to get back there in the near future. So we're hoping and praying that the situation there normalizes a little bit more, some more of the border restrictions are eased, and that we could get back the middle of next year. In the meantime, though, I've actually started to become involved again with theological education in Thailand. Bangkok Bible Seminary, where I taught previously, they want me to be a dissertation advisor for some of their doctor of ministry students. So now that I have a PhD, they say, okay, well, we want you to do this, since you technically have the 3 little letters that you need for this. So I've started to meet with some Thai students on Zoom, to contact them on email. Most recently, I've been in touch with a Thai pastor in Hong Kong who is pastoring a Thai church in Hong Kong, and he wants to look at how do we reach Thai people in the diaspora. So we went back and forth, and I introduced him to diaspora missiology, and it's like, okay, well, you need to focus your project a little bit can't just, do write a dissertation about, how to reach Thai people. Let's narrow it down a little bit. And so, okay, well, what are the special factors relevant for Thai people who are living outside of their home country? And it's a neat project that he's going to do because it'll have relevance for reaching Thai people in the United States, in Australia, in Switzerland, in wherever. So I've been really glad to put my feet back into the waters of Thai theological education again, even if it's virtually. Also in Florida, we've started to get connected with a Thai church there. They meet for Bible study in a park about half an hour from us once a month, and then they have the main church, which is about 2 hours further south near Fort Lauderdale. So I've been down there to preach, and I did some translation for the pastor at a Thai Christian retreat for Florida. He preached in Thai. I translated into English for the non-Thai speakers. So it's been neat, the opportunities the Lord is opening up for us. Recently, so in addition to those Thai opportunities, I recently was at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, spoke at a student luncheon about the place of the contribution that Reformed believers can make for the global church. So my wife and I have been encouraged about the opportunities we've had to visit churches and to be involved in Thai ministry here. But do pray for us. We're really hoping to get back to Thailand. I just want to give a few prayer points here, and then I think I'm going to have to wrap up. But I will be around today. I'll be around after, between now and the service, and then afterwards for questions. On page 3 there, just a few prayer points. Pray for evangelism in Thailand, for healthy growth and biblical teaching in the churches. There's a lot of churches that don't have great teaching there, but being at a seminary, and I do a fair amount of writing as well. There's an opportunity for broader impact with the churches. Pray for Thai Christian responses to COVID-19, political conflict. They've had street protests, and then changing. When I say changing, I mean more liberalizing Thai laws regarding abortion and LGBT issues. It's not a positive direction with COVID-19. I think we really need to pray that Thai people would not be afraid, that Thai Christians would hold out the hope of the gospel of peace and security that we have in Christ, because there's scary things in this world, whether it's just our perception or whether it's an actual danger. People are afraid in Thailand because of the way COVID and the responses to it have developed. People are afraid, and my prayer for Thai Christians is that they would not be afraid, and that they would be able to say to their neighbors, "You don't need to be afraid. There is a God who made this world and rules over it, and no matter what happens to us, He cares for us, and He is in charge." And if you could pray for my wife and I and for our kids to get back to Thailand. We need visas. We need some more financial support, and then for an easing of the COVID situation. If you want to keep up with us and where we are and to pray for us, at the very bottom of page 3 there, there's a URL. You can sign up for our prayer letter. Currently, we're sending out a prayer letter about every 1 to 3 months. So I have been strictly charged to end at 9:35, which I will do so that we can move on to other things and get ready for service. So thanks for listening, and I'm happy to chat with you afterwards.